As we discussed earlier, a little bit about bias and representation, sometimes we end up with non-random samples, right, in our process. And what happens with non-random samples is many times those non-random samples are not representative of the population. And so this occurs sometimes when we do um, either a voluntary kind of sample where we get voluntary response bias, where people just choose to participate or say, I want to do the survey or I want to be part of this, right? Those people are volunteering to um, to participate in this, and we're not controlling for or randomly kind of identifying and ensuring that they're representative of the population. So that would potentially produce what we call voluntary response bias. Versus convenience samples is where you just select people, whatever's convenient to you. The first 100 people walking to the store. I'm going to go to the library and just ask everyone at the library. Again, there's no assurance that those samples are representative, right, of the population that we're interested in, right? And that would be a convenience sample. Again, sometimes they have some overlapping qualities where they your non-random method could actually be both types, right? Versus so just keep that in mind. We identify them separately, but sometimes they're actually could be at the same time, right? Your convenience sample is also includes voluntary response bias. So, but it's just really important idea is this idea of non-random samples. And what happens with non-random samples sometimes um, again, they doesn't become representative, which leads to other types of bias, which we call response bias. And that happens when the respondents to a survey respond to your questions, right? But not inaccurately in the sense not that they're wrong, but that they're answering because somehow they've been persuaded by either the questioning of the words, right? How you ask the questions, or they're with other people, so they change their answer. They don't want people to know the real truth, right? Or the person conducting the survey has an influence on them, right? Not just the wording, but the person, right? Like your parents asking you a question, you may give them a response that you think they want to hear versus the truth, and that would be response bias. Non-response bias is the idea that you do a survey and a certain group of people don't answer. So that produces non-response, right? I know nothing about the people who didn't answer. They just refuse to participate or they're not interested in the topic. So I know nothing about them. So that would be a non-response bias, which could lead to what we call under coverage, meaning that we just didn't ask enough people, right, from the population, or we don't have enough people that represent, right? And this often happens again. It's not always just one type of bias. That undercoverage occurs sometimes with the result as a result of convenience sampling, right? I just don't ask enough people or I don't get enough of different types of people. And so that would lead us with that. Now, here are a couple examples that we would have covered in class. You could, I think, pause the video and take a look at these here. Again, really thinking about what the population is, what the sample parameter statistic, and in this first case, it's represented because it's very large in how it's done, versus the second one where there could be some different types of bias, voluntary bias or convenience sampling, or even response bias, right? Based on how the data is collected. So something to look at as you look at the answers here for that. And then we end this lesson 1.2 with some other terms that you want to be aware of. We've talked about the sampling frame, right? This is the group that we take from the population and then we sample from that group. And the last example I think was with the classes, the math classes that we did in lesson 1.1. And then you have different types of studies, right? When we do a study and you hear this word, it's really just doing statistics, collecting data, this idea of a study. There are a couple of studies. A retrospective study is one where we look at data from the past versus a prospective study, right, where you can see here it's a study where the sample's identified and watched over a period of time. So not just now, we're going to also collect data from them in the future. So we're going to track them. Sometimes it's called a cohort study. A key word there. Again, just some key words about what statistics is. And we'll go into this a little bit later too, but our introduction to these other types of studies, observational studies versus experiments, right? And so when we do an observational study, we study people or things, right? The units, right? Those are called observational units, right? Or well, you take the measurements on those individuals, and then you have experimental units too, right? Is a single individual that's participating in an experiment, and we'll talk more about that.